the diet that well. So where do you really start with all this complexity? And I would argue that starting with carbs makes a lot of sense. So beginning to understand how to personalize carbohydrate intake um, is an area where I think we can actually make some significant traction. And part of the reason is carbs are more than just fuel. I mean, that's what you read in the textbooks and you're taught. And it's true. But more than that, carbs are a potent regulator of metabolism in that they control how your body burns fat. And what I mean by that is when we eat carbohydrates, because we don't store them in appreciable amounts, a little bit in glycogen, we therefore have to get rid of them somehow. And the way we get rid of them is we burn them for fuel. But a lot of people don't burn them very well, so they end up converting them to fat too. But the bottom line is that this type of metabolic response locks people into a storage mode, where if you're overweight or obese, your problem isn't calories in, calories out. Your problem is you store an excess amount of energy in your fat cells. And that's a subtle difference, but an incredibly important one, because if that's the problem, logically the answer involves understanding what controls access to your fat cells. And that's insulin. And insulin's tied to carbohydrate. So carbohydrates control fuel use. And in particular, it inhibits access to fat. Nevertheless, in the population, you can see a wide range of tolerance to carbohydrates. Such some people do fine on high carbs, some don't. And if you're thinking, a low-carb diet's sort of extreme or unbalanced or violates this ideal of moderation that we have, think about it from the evolutionary perspective, where during the majority of human history, we've evolved in the context of a diet that was relatively limited in carbohydrates, at least during most of the year. And so it's not that difficult to imagine that we still retain all this metabolic machinery and programs to deal with a low-carb diet. And that's what I'm trying to show here. When we slide people up and down in carbs, basically you get a lot of variability, but you get a whole lot more variability in response when you increase carbs, such that a lot of people will develop metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. But when we bring people down to very low levels of carbs, sort of keto adaptation, it's a rather uniform response, suggesting that it's a very conserved trait to respond properly to a ketogenic diet, even if you have profound insulin resistance. So let's switch gears a little bit, and this graph shows the dietary patterns over the last 4 decades from N. Haynes, arguably our best data source on food intake. And so we've really not changed our intake of protein and fat to a great extent. If anything, we've decreased our fat intake slightly, and that's what we've been told to do. Clearly, the most salient change has been a marked increase in carbohydrate to the tune of about 200 additional kcals per day, and that's probably not, fibrous vegetables here. It's just sugar and processed, quickly absorbed forms of carbohydrate. And the question is, should we be concerned about this extra carbs we're consuming? And I would argue, yeah, we should be concerned. But let me ask, there's a lot of smart people in the room. How much total sugar do you have in your bloodstream right now? Any ideas?
The wine.
Let me rephrase. In gram amounts here of carbohydrate, or even teaspoons or tablespoons, whatever unit you prefer, we'll convert. 30 grams, pretty high. It's actually about 2 teaspoons, 1 teaspoon being about 4 grams. So you'd be pretty diabetic if you had 30 grams. But it's not that much. I mean, consider not even a large meal, but an average trip to Starbucks. You grab a bagel and a low-fat latte, and right off the bat, you're at 10 times the amount in your blood. So, that puts a bit of a stress on the body to process that because we can't store it that well, remember? So I'm going to dip a little bit into metabolism here. I won't go too far. But when you ingest carbohydrates, so say you just had that meal that contained 10 times the amount in your blood, a healthy person primarily takes up that incoming carbohydrate into skeletal muscle, where it's eventually oxidized. It might be converted to glycogen first, and that would be considered more or less a healthy disposal of carbs. But if you're insulin resistant or carb intolerant, a greater proportion of that incoming carbohydrate goes to the liver, where it's converted to fat. That process is called lipogenesis, the formation of fat from non-fat sources. So carbohydrate can be converted to fat, and that happens in generally people who are overweight or insulin resistant. And when that happens, the liver actually makes fat and releases it as VLDL particles, and it actually makes a saturated fat, palmitic acid. So I'll come back to that. But in particular, saturated fats go up when you overconsume carbs relative to your tolerance, and so does this particular fatty acid. And this is not really benign. You can imagine continually having these repeated insults where you're converting more and more carbs to fat. Ultimately leads to a cascade or a ripple effect where you have potentially a lot of collateral damage occurring, leading to metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. And so I would argue this alternative or secondary path of carbohydrate is a form of carbohydrate intolerance. And I like to use that term to describe the condition because it's almost intuitive what a solution would be. And so the idea here is that insulin resistance, which is incredibly complex, and there's billions of dollars being thrown at trying to understand this, really functionally manifests itself as a form of carb intolerance. And if you're lactose intolerant, what do you do? You restrict lactose to a level you can tolerate. If you're gluten intolerant, you restrict gluten. Well, if you're carb intolerant, it makes sense you would restrict carbohydrates. And so an important principle here, though, is that people vary widely in their ability to process carbohydrates in a healthy way. If you happen to be a person who can metabolize carbs, you have more options. You can do well on high carb or low carb or moderate carb. But if you have any of these conditions, it's likely you're going to need to restrict carbs to some level. And along those lines, you can think of type 2 diabetes in particular then, which is, the cardinal feature of type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance, as a side effect of consuming too much carbohydrate. And the last part here is important, relative to your tolerance. So I can't say that this is a specific level of carbohydrate universally because it does depend on the level of tolerance, which varies. And this is not trivial in terms of how many people this affects. If 3/4 or 2/3 of the people in the U.S. are overweight, it's likely they have some level of insulin resistance, and I would argue they're not well suited to the current dietary guidelines which promote low fat. And when we look at this globally, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people that probably would benefit significantly, especially type 2 diabetics, from restricting carbs. So is there any evidence this actually works in research studies? And the answer is yes. I'll show you one example here. This is a relatively well-publicized study back when it was first published in JAMA called the A to Z study, done by Chris Gardner out at Stanford. And it compared Atkins' diet to Ornish and a couple other diets over a year period. And they basically showed the Atkins diet was superior to these other diets in terms of weight loss. And that was interesting, but the more, I think, provocative result came a few years later where they went back and did a retrospective analysis and put the participants into tertiles based on their level of insulin resistance. And they compared the two extreme diets, the low-carb Atkins and the low-fat Ornish, high-carb. And basically what they showed was that if you were randomized to the low-carb arm, it didn't matter if you were insulin resistant or insulin sensitive, you lost a significant amount of weight. But if you were assigned to the Ornish low-fat diet, you did well if you were insulin sensitive, but if you were insulin resistant, you didn't lose much weight at all. So that sort of confirms this idea of carbohydrate intolerance. Basically means you've got to restrict carbs to some level. So another way to sort of look at this whole scenario is from a metabolic perspective. And in many ways, what we're talking about here is switching from a carb-based metabolism to one that's almost exclusively based on using fat or lipid as fuel, in particular fatty acids and ketones as your primary fuel. And an important point here is that diet, more specifically the carbohydrate in your diet, is by far the dominant factor that can drive this dominance in terms of fuel use. And there's a lot of research, basic science research going on in terms of fuel use. So we know, for example, cancer cells that are based primarily on glycolytic metabolism basically they do well, they proliferate on this type of metabolism. But when we switch their metabolism over to fatty acids and ketones, we basically are seeing regression of tumors. And we're seeing all sorts of evidence that this type of metabolic shift is associated with life extension and reduced oxidative stress, more or less anti-aging. So there's a lot of basic science and cellular adaptations associated with this type of metabolism that are all positive. And that's where my interest lies in how does all this play out when you shift a person over to a fat-based metabolism in terms of various health markers and even performance. And so I have a lot of fun in the lab because we get to study people who have type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes on one end of the spectrum, but on the other end, we're studying some of the most elite athletes, world-class athletes, and how they respond to shifting their metabolism as well. And I'll share a little bit with you in terms of different sort of spots on that continuum. And if you don't believe that carbohydrates regulate fat metabolism, here's the sort of most important graph, I think, that shows that. So you've got insulin concentration on the x-axis. This is basically fat breakdown here. And you see that the relationship is not a straight line. It's, in fact, a curvilinear relationship such that in this range here, just small reductions in insulin translate into huge changes in fat breakdown. So if you decrease your insulin just a little bit, and this is well within the physiologic range, you have a dramatic impact on fat burning. So when you eat sugar or starch, you get a rapid increase in your blood sugar. And of course, that causes your pancreas to secrete insulin, so you get an insulin surge as well. And of course, that tends to result in this rebound low blood sugar or sugar crash, and that we all know that doesn't feel well, and you're tired, and that's when you put your head gently down after lunch and try to take a little nap, or you go and seek out more carbs to bring your sugar back up. So that's obviously not good. But what's more insidious here is the insulin spike that accompanies the sugar spike, because as I said, that is blocking access to fat as fuel. And for people that are trying to lose weight, that's exactly what you're trying to burn down. So I want to now transition into ketosis. And ketones are incredibly misunderstood metabolites, even by most physicians and healthcare professionals. The truth is, ketones are a natural part of human metabolism, incredibly important aspect from an evolutionary perspective in terms of providing a fuel source for the brain during periods of prolonged starvation. Basically allowed us as Homo sapiens to develop big brains, which is probably the most unique aspect of our species. So that when I talk about ketones, I'm referring to beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. They're produced in the liver when carbohydrates are limited. And we largely all have the capability of producing ketones. It's just that most of us, unless we're following a low carbohydrate diet, that program is being suppressed because of the carbs we're eating. So it never gets a chance to boot up and run. It's a software program that's just sitting there dormant unless you unleash it by restricting carbs. And one of the most important functions of ketones is to provide fuel for the brain. So in a normal fed state, the brain is a glucose-dependent organ, getting almost exclusively all its energy from carbohydrate or glucose. But in ketosis, more than half of the energy, perhaps up to 2/3 or 3/4 of the energy the brain needs comes from ketones. And the brain's pretty metabolically active organ. I mean, it burns about 600 kcals per day just being a brain. And so that's roughly 150 grams of glucose it requires, unless you have ketones circulating around. So this is really important effect because now you have a very stable and sustainable fuel source for the brain. And this is just some terms because people get confused. So ketones are these metabolites that our liver makes when carbohydrates are limited in the diet. Ketosis is that process by which the ketones are generated. And there's no real threshold here, but we tend to use this as sort of a threshold to define when a person is in ketosis compared to most people in the fed state are below 0.1. So now we're at 0.5. And so we call this gradual increase in ketones nutritional ketosis. In contradistinction to ketoacidosis, which is where a lot of the negative connotations of ketones come from, because that is that's a very serious condition where when insulin is insufficient, so this is in type 1 diabetics, ketones are allowed to accumulate to levels that do become acidic and can be toxic. But in nutritional ketosis, in someone who has basal levels of insulin, this never happens. So unless you're a type 1 diabetic, you don't have to worry about levels this high. Unless, of course, maybe you're supplementing with large amounts of ketone esters, which gets into another whole aspect of this research. Keto adaptation, then, as I talked about, is really this process of adapting to a low carbohydrate diet, which we've learned does take time. It takes a couple weeks or even months for all these adaptations to occur. And so this just kind of shows you the range of ketones. We're talking about nutritional ketosis starting at about 0.5 and extending perhaps out to 3, 4, maybe 5 millimolar. Contrast that with ketoacidosis, which is really 10, 15, 20 millimolar. And this is a fascinating study that I just wanted to show because it's a study you probably won't see replicated because of IRBs. But this was a study done by George Cahill, who did a lot of the elegant experiments on ketosis. He took a group of people who had been starved for 4 weeks. And you can see they had very high ketone levels here, around 5 millimolar. And then infused insulin into these people, such that their fasting blood sugar levels, which were normal, 70 milligrams per deciliter, plummeted to levels, in some cases, they reported below 20 milligrams per deciliter. Now, to put that in perspective, if you're not from a medical background, if you have a level in that range with 20, 25, you would almost surely be in a coma and probably die. The body doesn't tolerate that level of hypoglycemia unless you have ketones around. So these people who had this level of glucose showed absolutely no signs or symptoms of low blood sugar. They were perfectly fine. So there is this profound protection against some of the signs and symptoms of low blood sugar when you're in a state of ketosis. And this plays out in important ways for athletes in terms of preventing hitting the wall, which is essentially a fuel crisis in your brain. And it plays out even in type 1 diabetics, who a major problem in type 1 diabetics is nocturnal low blood sugar. So they often have episodes of hypoglycemia during the night and other clinical conditions. So we've also learned a lot about ketones more recently in terms of their metabolism and some other provocative effects. So one way to think about ketones, I like to describe them as clean burning fuel. And by that I mean they don't generate as many free radicals as other nutrients do when they're being burned. So there's less generation of these reactive oxygen species or free radicals. It's also been shown that they are more efficient in providing ATP or energy. So you get more ATP and more total work done when you're burning ketones relative to other fuels. And I think one other extremely important study that was published just last December in a little journal called Science that showed essentially ketones were acting as epigenetic modulators of metabolism. Now that's a mouthful. Basically what that means is ketones were acting as signals to, in this case, increase gene expression of a whole array of antioxidant genes that protected against oxidative stress. So sort of independent of their role as fuel for the brain and other tissues, they were regulating metabolism. And then, of course, they worked out the mechanism through histone deacetylase inhibition. And let me tell you, almost every pharmaceutical company has their pharma development teams trying to develop drugs to inhibit histone deacetylases. And I know you can't see this very well, but the effects of ketones in this study were profound, such that if this was a drug, it would be a blockbuster. So getting a little bit into the science of low-carb diets, I've been in this business for a while, and it's nice to see that people are somewhat catching up here. These are all review papers in the last year. I think this is all 2013. And they're all more or less coming to the same conclusion that low-carbohydrate diets are at least as effective, usually more effective than low-fat diets for treating a variety of conditions. So not just weight loss, but improvements in cholesterol metabolism and insulin sensitivity, blood pressure, inflammation. And this is despite the fact that most of the studies out there are pretty sloppy. It's actually pretty